In the past, we have always measured our progress in terms of the goods and the services we produce and we consume, and we value those at the market prices we pay for them. We never did that for nature. For the goods and services that we produce, that is relatively fine, but nature provides services, has value that we could not measure in our accounting framework, the system of national accounts. Everyone knows about GDP, but that doesn't take into account all of the value that we get from nature. So to the extent that we can bridge nature and the economy, we can start to take into account in our measurement of our economic progress, what's happening at the same time to nature. Because since we don't have to account for it now, since we have never taken it into account in the past, we've treated nature as if it were free and as if it were limitless. And so we've been degrading nature, using it up without really being aware of what we were doing, of how much value we were losing in doing so. So bridging that gap, getting nature and the economy to be counted in the same breath, within the same framework, will allow us to see how our economic activities may affect nature, how the presence of nature affects us as a race, as a society, as a species, and how our activities could be changed so that we can achieve prosperity without damaging or destroying nature in the process. Well, right now, of course, the consequences of ignoring nature are becoming more and more evident. We see a rising frequency of climate-related disasters, weather changes that are affecting agricultural productivity. We see that with the emergence of the COVID-19 epidemic, that there are consequences to the way in which we sort of incur damage to the biodiversity, to our natural environment around us, the so-called zoonotic diseases that are starting to affect us more and more. And we realize that we have a rapidly closing window of opportunity to fix these problems. And so to the extent that we can better understand the scope of the problem, how much damage we're doing and what needs to be done to affect it, it's particularly urgent that we can act now, while we still have the opportunity to do it in a considered and rational way, rather than to wait until we're at the brink of a catastrophe and we're forced to adjust in a very painful and rapid manner. Well, one very helpful example is a forest. Everybody looks at a forest and we understand that if we cut the trees down, we can sell the timber, and that has a value, and we use the timber for all sorts of things. But we also think of a forest sometimes as a place we might go and like to take a walk. So for recreation, it's a nice place to go camping or to go and take an afternoon stroll. And that has a value, although we can't put a market value to it. But a forest, a healthy forest, also produces all sorts of other services, helping to regulate the climate, the hydrological cycle. It absorbs water from rainfall and prevents it from leading into soil erosion. It filters the water that goes down into the aqueducts, into the groundwater. And all of these services we benefit from. We don't see them, we don't measure them now, but they're very important. And when that forest is cut down for timber, we lose those services. Now, to the extent that we start to measure what those ecosystem services are, then we can make a better judgment about whether it is actually a good thing to cut down the forest and sell off the timber, or whether we should limit the amount to which we cut down the trees, sell some of them but not all of them, and maintain the capacity of the forest to continue providing us with those ecosystem services that we actually do depend on. So that's one of the real advantages of this effort to account for nature. It is that it brings into visible evidence the various contributions and the various benefits that we as human beings derive from nature, derive from the ecosystems, even if we don't see them visibly on a day-to-day basis. The first thing I would say is that we're not trying to put a price on nature. What we're trying to do is to assign a value to it. So to the extent that we start to understand that value, assign these values and monitor them, we're not putting trees and fish and clean water on the marketplace and buying and selling them. We're trying to assign a value so that we can fit that into what we do in our overall economic activities, we can understand how we might affect the nature, those physical assets that we have, the natural capital, and we can understand how we have to make better efforts to preserve them, because if we don't, we will lose that value, we will lose that benefit that we draw from having that nature around us. If a country, for example, that has a set of healthy forests were to proceed and cut down all of those forests and use them up, yes, it would realize a monetary gain by selling the timber, but it would also realize a very substantial loss of ecosystem services that those forests provide. Now, in that context, that country over time may very well end up being worse off. It may very well find that its overall stock of capital, the various types of capital that contribute to its future prosperity, may be lower by virtue of the fact that that natural capital has been exhausted. On the other hand, we know that there are certain services we get from having a healthy environment around us, but we can always improve the way we manage our natural resources. We can improve our protection of the environment. And if we, for example, were to improve the health of our forests or the quality of the water and the air that we use, that we breathe, then the value of the benefits that we get from nature, that value can go up. And so being aware of the value of ecosystems, the value of nature, allows us to manage it better. And by managing it better, we increase the benefits we draw from it. That can make a country, can make a society richer over time, if that's an appropriate word to use. So it can go in either direction. It just depends on how these assets are managed based on the information that we have. And we can do that as well now when we look at the relationship between countries as well. Because like the system of national accounts and the gross domestic product, the GDP measure that we talk about, all countries will be doing this measurement on the same basis. So that means the values in country A of the natural assets, of the natural capital of nature, will be comparable to the values in country B. And one can see if, for example, through trade, one country is running down its natural capital and reducing the value, the benefits that it gains from nature, while another country may be able to preserve its value and import the natural resources of another country. And that sort of understanding of how trade and how the exchange between countries in natural assets occurs can also lead us to think about how we might want to manage that more effectively and more rationally to the mutual benefit of both countries. I think one really important thing to notice here is that each of us have a different interaction with nature, or groups of people in a society will have different relationships with nature. There are some people, for example, who are living in agriculture. For them, rainfall patterns are existential. The quality of the soil determines the quality of their income. And so any change that happens to an ecosystem that affects their livelihoods also affects their ability to earn an income and how well they're placed in society. Now, if I earn my income doing intellectual work where I'm not dependent on nature, but somebody else earns their livelihood through interactions with nature, through helping provide ecosystem services, through agriculture, for example, it means that a change in the environment, a degradation, a deterioration in the environment is going to affect that person far more directly and far more deeply than it would affect a person who doesn't depend on nature for their livelihood. That means that any progress, any sort of activity that has a negative impact on the environment is going to affect different groups of people in different ways. And that will inevitably widen the inequalities that already exist. Taking account of nature the way it is proposed will allow us also to identify who benefits how from the services that nature provides, and who would suffer how if those services were no longer available. It also allows us to see how, by making efforts to preserve and protect nature, we are in fact preserving and protecting the livelihoods and the incomes of millions, hundreds of millions of people who depend on nature for their lives. And so this is where we can start to formulate much better informed policies that allow us to make changes in the way we do things that benefit those people who would otherwise suffer from the degradation of the environment or the depletion of natural resources. One of the reasons why we are able to insist on climate action, why there's so much attention paid to climate change these days, is because the nature of the problem is clear. We have global warming, we have CO2 emissions and other greenhouse gases, and we see the link between the greenhouse gases, the global warming, and the climate change. And we can put a number on how much global warming we can live with, and beyond which we are really in danger of irreversible problems. We do not have that luxury in biodiversity. The biodiversity of one ecosystem is entirely different to the biodiversity of another. It's very hard to come up with one single number, one single fact that can mobilize the entire world. And that is why measuring our ecosystems, measuring the value that we get from the ecosystem, from nature itself, becomes so critically important. Because every country will be doing this, and every country will be measuring it in the same way. And every country now can see the value of its own ecosystems. And the ecosystems in the Arctic are fundamentally different from the ecosystems in the Sahara, but they all have a value. And as we start to understand what that value is, it becomes easier, it becomes more clear why we need to protect the ecosystems and what we need to do to protect those ecosystems, because we're measuring them. We're measuring the value, we're measuring the services that they provide. And then it becomes much less important that there are differences between the type of ecosystem in one region and the type of ecosystem in another. What is important is the value that human beings derive from those ecosystems. And measuring those values allows us then to decide what we need to do to protect them. And that, I think, will give a great boost to the biodiversity agenda and help us actually to come up with something very useful in measuring and managing the biodiversity situation at the next meeting of the Conference of Parties. I think what I would like to point out here is that this system is the first step in a process of moving towards a more integrated accounting for our progress as a species. Right now, we take account of the things that we can measure. The things that we measure are the things that we manage. And thus far, we've been not measuring and consequently not properly managing the natural world around us. But the degradation and the climate change and the biodiversity loss have become critical, urgent matters. And we realize that unless we can do that better, manage the natural world around us better, we are destroying the very foundation of all of our activities, all of our societies, of our life on this planet. Ignoring nature, we do at our peril. Ignoring nature causes costs that have been in the trillions and have been going on for decades. We need only to look at what has been happening in the US over the last week in Texas with the cold spell and the tremendous economic and social damage that strange weather pattern has caused. And we can easily see that weather pattern is due to what has been going on the climate front more generally. It's the same thing with the way in which we've managed nature. We have 6.5 million premature deaths every year that are due to air pollution, dirty air, people breathing dirty air, dying of upper respiratory disease. 6.5 million, 3 million of them children. That is a cost that we incur every single year without batting an eyelid. Everything we do costs. But we need to think of it not only as a cost, but far more as an investment. Nobody would complain if we invest in the physical infrastructure that we need. Nobody would complain if we build a school or a hospital. Nobody would think that is a waste of money or a cost. They think of it as an investment in our health, an investment in our society, an investment in our future. It is exactly the same with managing nature. It is an investment in a healthy nature which we need to survive. It is an investment in the services that we want to continue to derive from having a healthy nature around us. And that investment is always going to be a fraction of the real cost that we would have to pay if we allow ourselves to lose those benefits, if we allow our climate to get out of control, if we allow biodiversity loss to continue unstopped. I think at this stage, we need to be looking at all possible innovative ways to manage the debt situation. But equally important, maybe more importantly, we need to be looking at all possible innovative ways to manage our nature, to manage our environment, to manage the climate action. And the debt for nature, the debt for climate swaps are a type of innovative approach that allows us to make progress on two fronts at the same time. We would be in a debt for climate swap, for example, we would be reducing the debt of a country in exchange for specific climate action that that government would undertake. So in other words, we are encouraging action that we would like to see, action that we all need, by reducing the burden of that debt on the country. And the same thing with debt for nature swaps. Now, these have existed for quite some time, and some of them have been done with considerable success. But now we're in a situation where we're approaching a crisis on both sides, on the debt side and on the nature side and on the climate side. And so I think that there is a tremendous potential for action here, especially in countries that might otherwise not have the resources to do the types of programs that we would need to see. And if by swapping the debt for the nature or swapping the debt for climate action, we can get these countries to do more and allow them the space to do more on those issues of debt and of climate and nature, I think that's a very good thing. And if at the same time in doing so, we can reduce the likelihood of a debt crisis that would throw everything off, then I think it is certainly a win-win situation that we should pursue. In many respects, we need to be looking more actively for solutions that allow us to make progress on more than one front at the same time, because we live in a world of constrained resources. And if we can make a progress in one area and at the same time generate a progress somewhere else, then I think that is something we have to explore very actively. What we need is for people to understand that if we continue to allow economics to dominate everything else, we are on a fast track to disaster. And we can change things, not easily, but we can change things through awareness. We need to know what we're doing. Being informed is the best way of being able to make the right choice. And what is absolutely critical now is that we do not allow the debate around these issues, around biodiversity protection or climate action, to be dominated by those with loud voices who want to preserve the status quo because of the vested interests. Those who pretend that biodiversity loss is not an issue, they are not telling the story as it is. And we cannot allow the debate to be dominated by those voices. We need to bring the evidence out. We need to show people what is actually happening. And we need to give them the perspective that we can fix this because we have the tools. And now we will have the information to be able to use those tools well. I say that there have always been the prophets in the wilderness who've been pointing out that there is more to life than just GDP. And some of these prophets have been really quite important members of the profession. It is changing. But what is going to drive a much faster pace of change is that business is changing. If you think now and you look around and you see how business operates, you'll see that this question of what they call ESG investing, environmental, social, and governance-based investing, is becoming more and more important. 5 years ago, that was a little niche that a few specialized firms would do off Wall Street. Now, the biggest investors are concerned about that. Now, we find central banks and financial regulators wondering what kind of information should companies and financial institutions report in order to give a clear sense of where they stand on this ESG agenda. It's interesting that the ESG agenda corresponds pretty closely to the SDG, the Sustainable Development Goals agenda as well. In fact, I like to think of it as a the corporate aspect of this larger global movement. This has happened. This is going on, and it has not happened because of government policy. It's happened because business and finance are aligning their activities to the Sustainable Development agenda. Now, that means that this issue of accounting for nature becomes much more important. Because again, the environmental part of it and the social part of it, these are elements of business management that were unseen 10, 20 years ago. And now they're becoming front center. They're coming into front center in the business models that companies are using and that investors are looking at. And so from that perspective, I think we will see a very rapid change in the economics profession, because it will have to adjust and align itself with the reality around it. We can no longer afford to focus on GDP if nobody's listening to us.